Having used Babbel and other apps, I was like, there's no way that these apps are really good for this. And I was surprised by the results.
Okay.
About 56%, almost 60% of the people improved at least one sub-band on the ACTFL scale. So rather than just looking down on them, let's do some empirical research.
How should institutions talk to their customers based on the approach that they use in teaching? What if the pitch was more, come use the language versus use a textbook?
I think that would be a novel idea. Are language programs sophisticated enough to know what they're offering? Some are, for sure, but I think many aren't. And so they may not be able to clearly articulate what their approach is. There was a time when I was very caught up in, is this implicit knowledge? Is this explicit knowledge? Is it proceduralized knowledge? And then at one point I'm like, who cares? It's what you can do with it.
Is instruction actually beneficial for second language acquisition? And if it is, can you pinpoint what those conditions are? What actually makes it effective?
Is instruction effective, or can instruction be effective? I think the answer is
This is the Teacher Talking Time podcast.
Today's guest is one of the most respected voices in applied linguistics, a researcher whose work bridges theory, classroom practice, and technology. Dr. Shawn Loewen is a professor of second language studies, TESOL, and applied linguistics at Michigan State University, where he also serves as a director of the SLS doctoral program. His research explores the intersection of research and practice, the dynamics of classroom interaction, and how mobile-assisted learning is reshaping the way languages are taught and learned. He is also the author and co-author of several influential books, including the 2024 textbook, A Practical Guide to Second Language Teaching and Learning, and the third edition, of course, of Introduction to Second Language Acquisition, which was released this year in 2025. He also co-edited the Routledge Handbook of Instructed SLA and serves as an associate editor of the Modern Language Journal. We had a phenomenal conversation with Dr. Loewen, and in this conversation, we asked him, how do we make research more meaningful for the classroom? What really helps students acquire grammar? And can apps actually support second language learning? Shawn brings a rare combination of research depth and classroom insight, and I truly believe that his answers will make you rethink what effective language teaching really looks like. I hope you enjoy the show. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Teacher Talking Time podcast. And in today's episode, we have someone. I was actually having a conversation with him right before we started the show and telling him how much we've been waiting to have him on the show. We've heard lots of wonderful things about his work. We've had guests who recommended his work to us. So we're very happy to have him here with us. Dr. Shawn Loewen, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
Shawn, you have quite an extensive career. You spent most of it at the intersection of research and classroom practice, not just also looking into language acquisition, but also thinking more actively about how teachers can use research more meaningfully. You also direct a doctoral program, you have published widely, and you have taught and also trained teachers across many contexts. But I think perhaps a good question for us to get the ball rolling here would be, what is the core mission behind your work, and how would you summarize what drives your research and who is it for?
My core mission is to make language acquisition easier for the average person who's learning a second language in a classroom. I didn't have the privilege of growing up bilingual. So I started my second language learning journey when I was about 13. Everything's come through blood, sweat, and tears. And anything that I can do to help make it easier for somebody in that situation, that's my underlying mission and what motivates me in my research. And interestingly, I would say a lot of our students here at Michigan State University are similar. We don't have a lot of diverse multilingual students. Some are, but 85% of our students, our undergrads, are from Michigan. And outside of Detroit, maybe Grand Rapids, there's not a ton of diversity. And so they're in a very similar situation in terms of learning second language. And yeah, so that's I would say my overarching mission, if you will.
Interesting, because you've mentioned that I was under the impression that you grew up bilingual. So perhaps you could walk us a little bit through your language learning. What languages did you learn and how did you learn them? What helped to learn them?
So I'm actually a victim of a language shift. My father grew up speaking a dialect of Low German. English was not his first language. I grew up in Southwest Kansas, but around the time of World War II, the anti-German sentiment, and there was also religion was also tied closely to the language that they were maintaining. And so there was a shift. And so I'm right at the cutoff. I did actually a bit of research in my home community. And I think the last person who learned Low German as a kid is about 5 years older than me. So I'm right on the cusp. So it was very unfortunate, but that's how it goes. So I studied Spanish. My parents thought I was too bored in high school or in junior high, so they hired a Spanish tutor for me and found out that I loved it. I was good at it and just really thrived on it. And I studied with her for I think a couple of years. I took language classes whenever I could in high school, which again, growing up in Southwest Kansas, and I went to high school in Oklahoma as well. There's not a lot, especially back in the day, there wasn't a lot of second language acquisition or second language materials. And so I was fortunate. I went to a school where there actually were a lot of Spanish speakers. And so I practiced it a lot. And I think that really helped me develop a bit more communicative competence than I would have had I been in just a straight classroom setting, learning grammar and that type of thing, because I did have that kind of instruction, but I also had that kind of social playing around with the language, just enjoying using it with friends. So that was really helpful. Studied French in university. I actually skipped one level of class because the teacher was teaching in English and I was like, this is horrible. I don't want to learn this way. So I just took myself out of that class and put myself in the next class and did quite well. Yeah, I've experienced a fair bit of the different pedagogical approaches to second language instruction. And then I also considered myself a linguist. My MA was in linguistics. And so just any language that I came across, I'd try to figure out some patterns, if I could learn a few phrases. So my latest acquisitional challenge, it was Polish, or is Polish. I spent a semester there in the fall of 2021, and I knew I got a Fulbright there, and I knew a year and a half ahead of time that I was going to be going. So I'm like, I can do some damage in a year and a half. I can actually learn something. So I devised an ad hoc, basically online language learning program for myself. And I thought anybody can use technology to learn a second language or to learn another language. It should be me. It was a really great experience. I used Duolingo, Babbel, Netflix, Google Translate, just anything and everything except for traditional classes. And I don't know if you know anything about Polish, but it's a heavily inflected language. Those are good Slavic languages. And I knew that basically every time I opened my mouth, I was going to be saying something grammatically incorrect. But I'm like, doesn't matter. I'm not going to study case endings. I'm just going to try to communicate. And it really enhanced my trip to Poland and my time there. And I was hoping to get to about like A2 on the Common European Framework of Reference. And I'd say I got to about 1.5, kind of self-assessed. If it had been maybe an easier language, I could have gotten a little bit further along. And I was just back there for a conference at the end of May, and I was pleased that I was able to still order in a shop and read some signs and stuff. So it's fun. I enjoy it. I enjoy learning languages.
Wow. That's impressive. Lou, do you remember? I think it was Paul Nation when we talked to him, where he said that on a flight from, I forget where.
Somewhere to like...
inside of Europe, Greece to Finland or something, he taught himself not taught himself, but taught himself to introduce him, like the basics of Greek, essentially on the flight of hello, how are you? Nice to meet you. I'm from, all that kind of stuff. That's so interesting.
great.
Everyone loves a good origin story, Shawn. Do you feel like you're describing, like as a teenager, dropping out of one class that wasn't for you, your career that turned into linguistics or language? Do you think that came from interest in high school, or did it come later?
No, it definitely started in high school. I enjoyed it, and I enjoyed the challenge. For some reason, the patterns of language came fairly easily to me compared to my classmates. And I really would have liked to have gotten a career learning languages, but that's not really a career. So I'm like, I guess I'll get a career teaching language like English. Yeah. I taught English starting in university, and that kind of, I just got interested in kind of the behind the scenes, I guess, if you will, aspects of it. And so I did a master's in linguistics at Temple University, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to do a PhD. My wife was like, you should just go for the PhD. And I'm like, yeah, but if you do that, you have to do the whole publish and perish thing. And I'm not sure if I like research. But turns out I did my master's. I'm like, I love research. So I had the privilege of, Rod Ellis was at Temple University when I was there. So I had a few classes with him in my master's. And then he suggested I continue doing a PhD there. So I continued on. He actually went to Auckland, New Zealand in the middle of my dissertation or in the middle of my program. So I followed him down there and got my degree from the University of Auckland, and then taught there for a few years. And then in 2006, I came to Michigan State University. So that's in a nutshell. And I never really had a goal of being a university professor, but I just followed my passion, and it just one step led to another, and been very fortunate that way.
Yeah. It's a couple of things I've noticed as you were saying what you just said. First of all, you've mentioned that you were able to figure out patterns. As someone who also learned languages growing up, I was also obsessed with languages, and I figured out my own patterns. I was hoping you could actually tell us exactly what patterns you were able to figure out, because I find that for some, I don't know if you're going to agree with me if there's research suggesting this, but for some reason, I feel like some people are able to look at language and they're able to see all these patterns emerging, and you can understand how certain languages operate, whereas other people are constantly trying to learn. Another thing I've noticed is that you always refer to it as acquisition rather than learning, which is something that we're also going to talk about. But perhaps you could tell us more about how you acquired or how you develop patterns, pattern mind, or I would say even an approach to learning a language through patterns, because I see language in patterns, and it's hard for me to explain to people who don't have a background in languages to explain that. So maybe you do a better job than I am going to be able to.
I think this is going to be trying to make implicit knowledge explicit.
Exactly.
Not that it's verbalizable, but I guess two things. I'll talk about the pattern recognition. I don't know. I would always pay attention to language, and I'd be like, I'd learned with Spanish, it's adjectives come after nouns. And so that was never hard for me. And I would always notice it in the input, and some of them I was able to pick up on my own. And even if I hear something in a language that I don't know or haven't studied, I'm still listening. Can I recognize anything? Do I hear any repetition? Is there anything that I can latch onto that helps me understand just a little bit of what's being said? But I think the other thing that goes hand in hand with that is I think I have a high tolerance for ambiguity. So I don't feel like I have to understand every word, every morpheme. So if I can get the gist, then I consider that a win. And so I'm definitely not somebody who is, as I said with Polish, you're going to make mistakes. It's just a terrible language. You can delete that or not.
Too many consonants.
Yep. I have a good friend who's Polish, and it's impossible to learn is what he says.
Yeah. But that just paying attention, and which obviously is an important theoretical construct. So it's just something that kind of came naturally to me, and it didn't feel effortful. It felt fun.
And you've also mentioned, as you were learning Spanish, that at one point French, you realized that instruction wasn't really helping you out as much as you thought it would. And I think many language learners only encounter language in a classroom. And you've mentioned that you're using Duolingo, Netflix, Babbel. And that raises to me a fundamental question. Is instruction actually beneficial for second language acquisition? And if it is, what could you pinpoint what those conditions are? What actually makes it effective?
You can also say no.
Let's just cut right to the heart of matter. Is instruction effective, or can instruction be effective? I think the answer is yes. I think otherwise there are thousands, I think if not millions of people, teachers, researchers, learners who are wasting their time and money. Is it as effective as it could be? Often not. And especially for adult learners, is it effective in the ways that is it effective in ways that help us develop communicative competence similar to L1? Probably not. And Bill Van Patten was my colleague for a while, and he definitely has a strong opinion about, I would say, the ineffectiveness of L2 instruction, especially the more explicit types of instruction. And I don't entirely disagree with him, but I do feel if instruction isn't good for something, then why are we spending all this time and effort, both as learners, as teachers, as researchers involved in it? So I think, to me, that's the crux of the matter is effective for what is the goal and how do you get there? And I feel like a lot of the mismatch that's happened in foreign language instruction in the US is people think of learning a second language as the ability to communicate, but a lot of what's taught in the classroom is explicit grammar rules and that type of thing, which doesn't enable you to communicate very well. So there's this mismatch between what's happening in the classroom and maybe students' expectations, maybe even teachers' expectations. So that's a whole dilemma. And I would say it's probabilistically effective, right? It's not always effective,
Right.
but there are things that learners can engage in, that teachers can do, that would help increase learning acquisition. We can talk about those terms if you like.
Yeah.
Development, I'm happy with that term too. So yeah, I think that there are numerous cases of people who learn languages only in the classroom. And is it just by accident that they learn? They might have high language aptitude, and there might be other factors as well. But some of it is they are able to use the input that they're given and to translate that, convert that into communicative proficiency in many cases, in some cases, maybe not many, but yeah. And the other thing, I'll just say, learning a second language takes time.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure in the US context if we really devote enough time for people to be successful as second language learners.
Right.
I know the situation, you're both in Canada. I know the situation is somewhat different there, but
People are always surprised when we don't speak French. Yeah. Doesn't everybody speak French? No.
They know a lot about French.
Yes.
Yes, they know a lot about the language, but it's the same thing. Like I was thinking about my mom. My mom was here and she's trying to relearn French because it's a language that she lost in her childhood. And when I was looking at what my mom was doing, Shawn, she was basically using a course book that had a lot of grammatical rules and a list of vocabulary of French words and things like that. And I kept saying to her, I was like, Mom, just read a few good books in French, go watch some Netflix, do something fun, maybe some, but she's like, oh no, but this helps me. And then I started thinking, I was like, okay, so if we were to ask whether instruction actually helps learners acquire a language, how should we define this help?
good question. I think that the input is key. It feels like an understatement here. If you're not, so the instruction hopefully provides good input, and that can be in terms of tasks, in terms of communicative content, but it also can be explicit grammar instruction, especially if it's happening in the target language. That's actually input. I guess in terms of help, I would say, is it helping develop vocabulary, making form-meaning connections? Is it helping figure out the grammatical system, maybe overtly so that you have explicit rules that you can draw on. And hopefully that also helps you then to proceduralize or develop implicit knowledge of those rules so that you can actually use them when you're communicating. So I would see, for me, it means progress in developing communicative ability through better vocabulary, better grammatical accuracy, maybe even through pronunciation or pragmatics, which we shouldn't forget as components of language.
Yes.
And so I guess that's a roundabout way or a long way of describing what I think help means.
Because I'm thinking about what you said in terms of communicative competence. If perhaps, because you said you were able, when you were learning Spanish, you were able to, you've mentioned that you were using it more socially, using it with friends to do things in the language. Is perhaps then communicative competence the most important benchmark? Or are we just oversimplifying what success could look like?
I think there it's important to ask the learner what their benchmark for success is. I think implicitly many learners, the average person, maybe when they think learning a language, they think success is being able to use the language in some meaningful way. Some people, though, the grammar is important, and for them, success is being able to understand the grammar rules. And as much as I believe in communicative language competence and teaching, I'm also a linguist, so I actually like grammar rules. So I am sympathetic to people who, maybe like your mother, want that those grammatical rules and that type of thing. But I think it's important for them to be aware that those aren't necessarily going to translate into being able to use those rules in communication.
I'm here with John from My Speaking Score. And John, I think we agree that as entrepreneurs, one of the toughest things for us is to describe and articulate our business, what we do, why we do it, why we love it, who it helps, what problem it solves, in a super short, crystal clear way that's clear to the audience. So why don't you give us your 20-second pitch of who you help at My Speaking Score?
It's a great question. My Speaking Score is an AI-powered platform that predicts TOEFL speaking scores and gives our users feedback on how specifically to improve their TOEFL speaking performance so they can get a high score on test day.
Incredible. So if you're listening to this, you're a teacher, you help students with TOEFL, help them get their speaking score on TOEFL. Check out myspeakingscore.com. John would love to chat with you about how you can work together to help your students pass their speaking score on the TOEFL test. John, thank you for this.
Thanks, Andrew.
To what extent does autonomy play here? And I don't mean motivation or like need to do it, but you've used the word aptitude a few times. And when you went to Poland and you used Duolingo and Babbel and these apps, and you were able to seemingly achieve a benchmark that you set for yourself. But I think we can say, I can assume that you had some autonomy or aptitude in what you're looking for and how these kind of puzzle pieces fit together already. How important is that? And if a learner is at a point where they're not able to do that, is what you did in Poland repeatable for many people?
Yes and no. So autonomy is important, and having a growth mindset of this is something I can do, this is something I can improve in. And obviously not everybody has that perspective, especially when it comes to language learning. So that can make it difficult. Motivation was important for me in that there was at one point, it looked like I might not be able to go because of COVID. And I slacked off my study and just was like, I'm not at the point where I have time in my life just to study language just because it's fun and for no other reason. There is a little bit more motivation to it than that. But there were also times when I was using different online materials that I was like, this is hard for me and I know what I'm doing. I'm an expert in this area. I can't imagine how a regular person who doesn't really know much about language learning, how they would navigate this in a way that would help them make a lot of progress. And so that's one thing. But on the other hand, I think technology does bring it, it helps with that autonomy because one, you have more access to materials, to input. I tried to find a French textbook for 2 years in my first years of high school, and I couldn't get one. It just wasn't there. And now in my autonomous Polish study, I was speaking with Polish speakers in Poland, not very well, but I had access to them, right? So there's so much more that's available, and some of it can be interesting and fun and challenging. And so that, I think, helps with the self-autonomy, self-directed learning, that type of thing. So that is, I think, a component. And what I would say for me, a lot of students come into the classroom, into foreign language classrooms where there's a requirement, and they may view it just as another subject that they have to study. They may not be very excited about it. But I guess, and what happened for me was something ignited that spark that I actually was like, hey, I enjoy this, I like it. And my research can help make that happen for a couple of more students, then great. Then I would consider it to be worth it. Again, I feel like that was a long way around to answer that question, but I hope it provides a little bit of addresses that question.
I think it's because I know the conversations that we've been having with people on the show and with listeners, I feel like there's still very much a divide between those who believe in explicit knowledge being able to be converted into implicit knowledge and those who are like, those are two separate things. I remember the episode we had with Bill Van Patten. He explained that very clearly by using the oil analogy. And I don't know where you stand on that, but perhaps you could talk a little bit more about explicit instruction improving our factual knowledge, which is what my mom has. She knows all the grammar rules in French. She knows all the vocabulary, but the moment I put her in a situation where she had to utter a few words in French, she couldn't do it. And I keep asking and telling people, it's like, my mom is a very good example of that. So perhaps you could tell us more about what the research suggests about how far explicit knowledge, implicit knowledge, how far that knowledge really goes in helping learners use a language more spontaneously.
That's a great question. And I guess I would just make a couple of ground rules or a couple of things in talking about this is that I've done some research on what is the nature of explicit knowledge, implicit knowledge, how do we measure it? And there was a time when I was very caught up in, is this implicit knowledge? Is this explicit knowledge? Is it proceduralized knowledge? And then at one point I'm like, who cares? It's what you can do with it. That's the important thing. So I've gotten less hung up on what do we call it and how does it convert from one to the other, or can it convert from one to the other? For me, the bottom line is it seems as though there are two different types of knowledge that allow us to do different things. And like I said, I have nothing against explicit linguistic knowledge. I consider myself a linguist, so I have a fair bit of explicit linguistic knowledge kicking around about a variety of different languages. But I also realize that doesn't mean that I can use them like your mom. I can't use them spontaneously when I'm trying to communicate. So there seems to be two different types. They have some characteristics that we can describe. The one, as I said, learning a second language takes time. And that's the thing about implicit knowledge. In order for it to develop well, it takes a lot of time. And if we think about L1 speakers, the first few years of their lives, one of their primary jobs is to learn a language, and they have years to do it. And we expect, at years of full-time study, we think that in grade school, middle school, high school, whatever, 4 hours a week for a semester is going to bring about that same type of ability. It's not. And so I think realism is important in what can be achieved. But I do, if I had to take a stand, I do think that explicit knowledge can be beneficial for L2. I don't use learning and acquisition. I don't differentiate between the two, second language learning or acquisition. I think if we can develop ways to help proceduralize or practice second language, that is going to be even more beneficial for developing that communicative competence.
Interesting. So you did mention that your point of view, your views have changed on this, and I know you've done extensive work on grammar instruction and how it actually plays out in the classroom. and that you seem to be, as you said, you described not as hung up on the distinction between the two, which is which. So how have your findings then, Shawn, how have your findings changed how you think about the role of grammar in a communicative classroom? What would you say to teachers who are still very much relying heavily on grammar-first approaches?
First, just to go back to the implicit, explicit knowledge, I realized that for me personally, it wasn't important to know the theoretical characteristics or explanations of those different types of knowledge. I was more interested in how do we get learners to develop those types of knowledge, whatever they're called. Like we can make up names for them, as some people have. So I didn't want to be I wasn't, and not that I have any problem with people who do just look at these things from a more theoretical perspective and try to understand the psycholinguistic differences, the mental representations, all of that. That's fine, but I just decided that wasn't who I wanted to be. And so I was more interested in, I guess I'd say, what are the implications of teaching grammar in the classroom for development of communicative competence? I keep coming back to that. But to me, that's the gold standard of what many people want to achieve when they're studying a second language. And I guess one of the studies that kind of exemplifies this, and I struggle with how to present it when I'm talking with teachers or doing a podcast like this, because I tend to overemphasize, I think, communicative language teaching, task-based language teaching, implicit instruction, not because I believe so strongly that's the only way, but I feel like the emphasis is so biased the other way, that to try to counter this heavy emphasis on explicit instruction that is out there, I try to maybe go to the other extreme of really pushing communicative language teaching, task-based instruction. But the study that I'm talking about was the one that we did with Babbel, and having students study Spanish for, I think it was 12 weeks. And when we were talking about designing the study, and I was like, we know they're going to learn some vocabulary and then we're going to learn grammar because that's what these apps are good for. But I really wanted to have a test of oral proficiency because, again, that's what I think is important, the ultimate goal. But I also, having used Babbel and other apps, I was like, these apps aren't really good at getting learners to use the language communicatively. Babbel does have a bit more dialogues and things that are quasi-communicative compared to like Duolingo, for example. So we had the oral proficiency interview. We were able to pay to have that because we had an industry partnership with Babbel, actually, and they paid for the tests. I think were $75 a pop. So that's not something you can easily. As a researcher at Michigan State, it wasn't something I could easily afford. So that actually was great that they helped give us some funding for that. And because I'm like, there's no way that these apps are really good for this. And I was surprised by the results. About 56%, almost 60% of the people improved at least one sub-band on the ACTFL scale. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with ACTFL, but the American Council of Foreign Language Teachers, and they have a scale that starts at novice. It has 4 bands, I think. Novice, intermediate, advanced, and superior. And then those are divided into low, intermediate, and high. And a lot of our students, our participants, were novice low or novice mid. And using Babbel for 12 weeks enabled many of them to make measurable gains on an externally validated test at oral proficiency. And granted, it's not much. Novice low to novice mid is not, you're not suddenly able to have deep conversations with people, but it was measurable.
Yeah.
So I was really shocked by that. And so it made me reconsider a little bit the benefits of a more explicit, maybe even a more kind of audiolingual approach to language instruction. It did have some measurable benefits for oral proficiency.
It's interesting because when I look at those apps, I don't like the apps that much, but they do work with those patterns that we're talking about. it's all about pattern learning. So you're like associating language, associating form to words, to meaning and things like that. I'm interested because I read the study, and I'm glad you brought it up because I wanted to ask you a question about that. What did you learn, or what did those studies tell you about how learners were using the apps? What were they gaining from them specifically, you think? What's your hypothesis on that?
Do you mean in terms of gaining in terms of types of knowledge?
Yeah, in terms of knowledge, in terms of competence to perform in a language. Were you able to identify that, how these people were? Because I remember you mentioned that they don't stick to because I think these apps have a 10-minute a day type of thing where you have to do this. And I think I remember in the study, many of the learners didn't really stick to it, but they were still improving.
Not surprisingly, the more they used it, the more they improved, right? One of the problem with the apps is, and I'm not the one who coined this, I don't know who did, but they're easy to pick up and they're easy to put down, right? They're fun. You play with them for a little while and then you get bored and you go on to something else. And so for language learning, that's a real problem because it takes time, right? So getting the learners to use it in a meaningful way. We were paying them as well, the participants, so we hoped that would motivate them. It didn't motivate them as much as we had hoped. I think this is where I think Duolingo actually does do a good job, is their gamification of keeping your streak alive.
Yeah, and streak, that was the word, yeah.
We can argue whether people are actually doing that streak to learn, or just, I had one participant in the study say they're just grinding it out to get the streak and they didn't care about the language learning. But if you're getting some input and you're using it, that's not a bad thing. And your question is a good one. And we did a few interviews after that Babbel study. And I don't remember if I specifically put this in the study, but we had one woman who studied, and I think she started at novice low even. And in her interview, she's like, yeah, I learned so much. I went to Cancun for spring break and I was able to speak the language and use it. And I was just like, wow, that's great. So I went and looked at her scores, and I think she made it to novice mid, which is being able to say hola and a little bit more than that. And I was just like, it gave her this huge confidence. And objectively, her linguistic ability wasn't that great, but maybe that confidence helped her feel like she could use the language. And you can communicate a lot with just a little bit of language, paralinguistic language or paralinguistic cues and all kinds of things. I would have liked to have followed up more on that, but I wasn't able to. But that was really interesting, the amount of confidence that it gave her. But we saw people improving on vocabulary. They gained vocabulary, and they gained the ability, I think, to put that vocabulary together in ways that allowed them to describe a bit more in response to the prompts from the oral proficiency interview, where they're asked to talk about your daily routine or something like that. They could do it a little bit better than they did the pre-test.
Over what period of time, Shawn, was it?
12 weeks.
12 weeks.
Not very long.
Not quite as
Interesting.
Cool.
Yeah, 12 weeks is, it's how long a program here is between 8 to 14 weeks.
Yeah.
And we wanted them to do about an hour a week. So we hoped that they would average 12 hours, and some of them did a lot less and a few of them did a lot more. And obviously the ones who did more learned more.
Do you know if they engaged with it outside of the apps? Were any of them motivated to then go out in the community and find the language or something like that?
We asked them not to. Obviously, we didn't want to bring in extraneous variables like using the language in addition to the app. Obviously, we only have their self-report of whether they said that they did or not. Many of these were undergraduate students, so I don't think they were motivated to go do another hour or two of Spanish study on their own. They had other things that they were interested in doing, I think. So we, as much as we could tell, it was due just to using Babbel. And we did find that motivation for learning Spanish was a significant predictor of improvement on the oral proficiency test. It didn't matter for the vocabulary or the grammar test, but it did seem that it was a very simple measure of motivation, just how interested are you in studying Spanish? And we measured that several times over this semester. And so it was a fairly simplistic measure, but a measure of motivation nonetheless that showed up in the equation model, the regression model, of having some influence on improvement on the oral proficiency test.
That's fascinating. Because it's very common I'm sure, Shawn, to like most people, all of you, teachers especially, myself included, to not, as Leo said, not a fan of the apps and stuff like this. But this is a very interesting. I think, I hope one purpose of our show is that we don't want to have our preconceived notions brought into these conversations.
Yeah.
And this is a very interesting result. Have you shared it with Babbel? Because I think
I had. Yeah, I actually was able to visit the Babbel headquarters in Berlin. I don't know if it was a year or relatively close to finishing the study, and I was able to present it there. And yeah, they were really interested. Obviously, they were, I think, happy with that result. And it was really interesting visiting their headquarters because as an instructed SLA researcher going into these studies, I'm like, these are gimmicky. They make promises that they can't possibly meet. But when I got there, I was really impressed with their level of dedication to language learning. That when their motto is everybody studying a language, which we can all get behind that.
Yeah.
We might quibble over maybe pedagogy or approach or things like that. But yeah, it was really a good opportunity for me. Industry academia partnerships are a bit tricky at times, and we had to negotiate a few things, but I feel like we did it in a kind of ethical, open, straightforward way. And my reason for getting into this was I felt like there was this bias against these apps from academics. And I'm like, millions of people are using these apps. We should, if we're SLA researchers, we should know something about them. We should be able to tell people, are they wasting their money? Are these good investments? So rather than just looking down on them, let's do some empirical research. And turns out it's been some of the only research that people outside of academia are interested in that I've done. It's
interesting. It's a very interesting thing you've mentioned there, Shawn, because usually what I see is people completely dismissing the apps or people saying you only need the apps. I think there's got to be some sort of middle ground here. And I think in the paper you did write that. You did mention that the real value of these tools are more as ancillary to classroom instruction. And I think that's the question that I have for you. What does that integration look like in practice? So basically you're taking classes and you're all using the apps. Like, what are some things what role should they play? Of course, we don't have this well-rounded language program anywhere that I know of, but what would that look like?
Sure. Ideally, I think it would be using, whether it's the apps or some type of technology, in an extracurricular way where the teacher is helping the learners figure out how to best use the app or the technology. And so, because learners don't always know the best way to use these apps. And so they get frustrated, they don't use them. Learners also, it was hard for me to stay motivated using them, and even for more so for people who are less interested in languages than I am. So I think having a teacher help students, I had a teacher that I worked with, and she was assigning, I think students were supposed to do, I don't know if it was an hour of extracurricular study. They could use whatever app they wanted to outside of the classroom. And I think they had to write a report maybe twice over the semester. And on the one hand, that's great. And it's getting them to engage with the language outside of the classroom. But what we talked about is ways that she could help them leverage those apps to improve learning. And so that's what I would see is the role of the teacher there would be to help learners know how to best use the technology, encourage them to use it. And so that way it gives them more access to the language. And that's always a good thing. And yeah, it can help keep them motivated and on track. And there's a couple of studies that I've done that have looked at that and seen that there does seem to be, and other people as well, not just me, that there is a benefit. And one of the ways forward, I think, is to integrate that type of learning beyond the classroom is with the teacher as a guide.
Yeah.
And I think...
No, go ahead, please.
I was going to say, I don't know if we want to bring up the term AI or not, but...
we definitely need to. The elephant in the room is here.
Yeah. One of the things teachers worry about losing their jobs to AI, and I think things are going to change, but I think teachers, one of the roles that they can play is helping learners know how to leverage those technology tools, whether it's AI, machine translation like Google Translate or something like that, to use them effectively. I know when I was in Poland, I used Google Translate actually a fair bit. And one of my colleagues was like, I'm surprised to see you using that. And I'm like, it's good if I want to figure out how to say something right before I go into a store, I put it in. But I also knew enough to know that sometimes it was not accurate. Like it was like, something's wrong here. I need to dig a little bit more. And so that's where having a teacher to help students reflect on how they're using these tools and AI, there's a lot of reflection that needs to happen on, is this accurate? Is this factual? How can I use this best for language learning? So that's, I think, a role that teachers can and should play.
I have a million stories like that. Like I used to live in Costa Rica, Shawn, and I learned Spanish there. And in the early days, I would do the same thing because you don't want to embarrass yourself. That was me, right? So you translate it before you go somewhere about yourself there, and you say it, and everyone looks at you funny. And I was like, did I say something wrong? You're like, no, that's correct, but you sound like we say this. And then, so it is like, even if it's grammatically correct or lexically correct, it may not be localized or what the vernacular that might be spoken locally. Right?
And that's a great learning opportunity, right? Because you've been able to get your message across and hopefully be understood, but you can also get feedback on how to say it more native or more accurately or whatever. So that's optimal language learning right there.
I was in my 20s at the time, and that and the other one I always got was, you sound like you're a 75-year-old person. They talk like that. Don't say that. A young person's,
That's great.
I think my question then goes back to the implicit, explicit. Do the apps qualify as explicit knowledge or implicit knowledge?
I would say they're mostly developing explicit knowledge.
Yeah, I thought so too.
Yeah.
And since we're talking about we're going back, I want to go back to communicative language teaching, because I know you also wrote a very good paper on the intersection of the relationship between task-based language teaching and instructed second language acquisition. And again, we're going to link that article in the show. We're going to link your website as well if people wanted to read that. But I remember you mentioning that the two of them, they both share a lot of common interests, especially within the cognitive interactionist foundation. But you mentioned that they diverge in terms of focus. So I don't know if my question is going to make sense, but where do you see the most productive intersections and tensions between task-based language teaching and instructed second language acquisition?
I'm glad we're just really getting to these hard-hitting, easy questions. I think one of the best intersections, I think, is that task-based language teaching brings to the table is that ability to help develop communicative competence. Learners are actually proceduralizing the knowledge by using it. They're practicing the language. And hopefully, if your mother were involved in a task-based language teaching class, she would get past that point where she'd be able to use some of that knowledge maybe in communicating. And so that would help. So I think that is one of the strengths that task-based language teaching brings, is that emphasis on communication that is often has been absent, is absent in many contexts, hopefully not as much anymore, but still is. There's a lot of explicit grammar translation type of instruction out there. And so I think that's one of the best things that it brings. And it brings a whole approach, a whole way of doing it through needs analysis and evaluation and all of that. So in that way, it's a complete package in terms of a pedagogical approach, which I argue then is also a bit of its downfall. One of the tensions that I see is the orthodoxy of TBLT. And does it have to be done this way? Or is it task-based language teaching, task-supported language teaching? I think in the TBLT world, a fair bit of energy and ink is spent discussing some of these finer points that don't really matter so much to the teachers, to the students. And if task-based language teaching doesn't start with a needs analysis, then is it really TBLT? From my understanding, Michael Long would say no, but you're not able to do a needs analysis. Does that then negate any of the positives of doing some task-focused, task-supported language teaching?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think so. So that sort of orthodoxy or theoretical rigor that is sometimes associated with TVLT, I think is maybe not as helpful for practitioners. But I don't know, you interviewed people at the TVLT conference, so it'd be interesting to know their thoughts on that.
It's funny you mentioned the orthodoxy of TBLT. We have engaged and conversed with a lot of people in the TBLT community who are completely against the idea of not using a needs analysis. I said in my situation, for example, teaching a college class, I do not use a needs analysis because there is a set curriculum. So what I try to do is look at the curriculum and try to devise tasks that would allow them to practice those language points that they want. Is that task-based language teaching? To me, it is, because I'm not focusing on the acquisition or the learning or the explicit learning of those rules. I don't want the learners to remember what the present perfect is for. I want them to be able to communicate in situations where the present perfect might be required. So in a way, I see where you're going with this, and I agree with you. But when I think about task-based language teaching, and I remember reading your Instructed SLA book, the ISLA, and you've mentioned that TBLT, there's always this over focus on the needs analysis, the real-world communication, whereas ISLA tends to focus more on different variables, instruction type, learner cognition. And I think in order for us to bring the two together, because I feel like what's not good for the bee, what's not good for the hive is not good for the bee. I think in a way, separating the two would not be a good idea. So what, from your perspective, Shawn, what can each approach learn from each other? And how can both teachers and researchers avoid, as we described, these false dichotomies between the two of them?
First, I would just clarify that so to me, Instructed SLA is a term for a field of study that involves research and theory and pedagogy. And TBLT is one example of that, as is
TPRS.
Yes, or input processing or grammar translation,
Yes.
even that. But I think one of the things, and that was actually a really influential article for me in developing my own thinking, and it helped clarify some of the things that you're asking me about right here. And one of the things that I saw that TBLT did well that I think many other approaches or aspects of ISLA might not do as well is it is a complete pedagogical approach. It's a complete package of, and one can argue, is the orthodoxy of that approach good? Maybe not, but it is a fully developed system. And I think that some of the other types of perspectives on instruction in ISLA aren't that fully developed. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's a strength of TBLT. But again, as we're doing this interview, I realize I don't think I'm not a purist, I guess. I'm not a theoretical purist. I'm going to do what works and gets things done for helping language learners. Is it explicit knowledge, implicit knowledge? Who cares? As long as we can help learners develop that.
Yeah.
Does TBLT need to be practiced? This using everything that Mike Long or Rod Ellis, according to all of those prescriptions that they laid out, maybe for the best effect. But if in your context you don't need to or even can't do a needs analysis, does that mean you should abandon TBLT altogether? No, I don't think so. I think it has a lot to offer, a lot of positive things to offer anyway. That would be, I think, one of the one of the things that I don't really want to get caught up in terms of debating the benefits or if it's task supported language teaching, then it's really not TBLT. Okay.
Nitpicking, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Let's just get them talking in the classroom.
No.
I'm always curious on the other side of this too, because we always talk from the teacher perspective, the researcher perspective, like, of course, right? But in this discussion of should it be like this? Should we do this? Should we do that? There's different profiles of people, right? There's people who, for whatever reason, can't or won't want to take an official language class and just use apps. There's people that use apps when they travel. There's people that take or select language classes to take. Talking like this, like from a program outwards, is probably too inside baseball for the customer, but would it be advantageous? Or if I'm signing up for a Japanese class. How can or should institutions talk to their customers based on the approach that they use in teaching?
Wow, I think that would be a novel idea. I'm not sure maybe I'm being too harsh on language programs. I'm not sure that that's a good
Because I
question.
feel like now
Not sure
it's just, I want to learn Japanese and I pick whatever. Because come
Right.
in and we'll learn, the explicitness is, at least in Canada, is pitched, right? Unless it's come from abroad and it's a cultural experience and that's the pitch. And as you mentioned, like TBLT, task supported to inside baseball, customer doesn't care, doesn't know. But what if the pitch was more come use the language versus use a textbook?
Ooh, I think in many ways that would be great. I guess one hesitation is, are language programs sophisticated enough to know what they're offering? Some are, for sure, but I think many aren't. And so they may not be able to clearly articulate what their approach is. And then I think another problem is students aren't knowledgeable enough to know what they need. If they think that language learning involves learning grammar rules, then they need to be educated, that students need to be educated. That's not really going to get them where they want to go if they want to be able to learn the language or to be able to speak the language, use the language for communication. And so I think you have a series of people or institutions that a lot depends on each one. And so the possibility for breakdown along the chain is high, that the chance for that not being communicated. I'm just trying to think about, I haven't seen a lot of the promotional material, for example, of language programs at MSU, but I'd be interested to know, how do they pitch their language classes? Do they mention communicative approach or whatever? They might, some of them might, I'm sure some of them don't. And even within a program, there's going to be differences on perspectives of what should we be doing in the classroom. So it gets really complicated, and sometimes I think it's no wonder students struggle and don't really know what to do, because I'll put the onus on me first, we as researchers maybe are not communicating clearly, and then teachers as well may not be communicating as clearly as students need as well. So it's a difficult endeavor, I would say.
No, it is. And not everyone, this is not our industry specific. Not every customer of whatever product you buy wants to know how the sausage is made per se.
Right.
But when it's a human experience, then maybe there's more to it.
One example that I love from a research project that I did in a Spanish class at MSU way back when, and the class was conducted all in Spanish, and I was doing some classroom observations and out-of-class testing, and one of the students after the test said, if I had known this class was going to be entirely in Spanish, I wouldn't have taken it. So for them, they didn't like the fact that this was all pedagogically was pretty good, right? That they were getting communicative language instruction. It was all in the target language. They didn't want that. And I didn't probe that more. Maybe they were just taking it for the grade. Maybe they felt more comfortable with some rules to hang on to. But very clearly, and it'd be interesting to know what it would have taken to convince her that, no, this is actually good for you and you should do more of it, when that was not her thing.
Just out of curiosity, I was just looking at a few programs here and seeing how they're describing their classes. And this one here addresses the needs of learners who want to improve or perfect their speaking, listening, reading, and writing. So I love that they use the word the needs here, and they also use the word perfect. And another one that I found here is basically saying that it will help you. Yeah, they don't talk much, Andrew, about, we'll use a communicative language approach to, but which I think it goes to show what Shawn is trying to say is, which I agree. I think a lot of institutions don't really have a very clear idea of what they want their learners to be able to do in the language. And when they do use the term communicative, I think they're paying lip service to it, but
And
not
to be
really
fair,
knowing.
like devil's advocate, like you have to, if you're a business, like you do what works to get customers in the door too, right? Like if they really started like saying what we're talking about now, I don't know that people would actually sign up because they'd be like, what is that? What does that mean?
Yes. Too explicit for them. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yes. Interesting. You were talking about this lack of dialogue or conversation between teachers and researchers, which is also something that you and I think Masatoshi Sato as well, you have written quite extensively about that. And I've seen conversations with the two of you and presentations. And perhaps one question that we have here that perhaps would lead us to the questions that we have from the audience, because I didn't realize how we have just passed the hour mark here. But when we started this podcast, Shawn, it was primarily because I didn't want to get into academia. I said, you know what? I had finished my master's, I had started my PhD, and I'm like, you know what? I don't think I want to do this. It's too long for me. And I said, I'd rather talk to all these people that I've read papers on, and I wanted to just have conversations with them and ask them all the questions, because I'm never going to have time to read all these papers. So I might as well just get them on the show and talk to them. And that's how we started the podcast. And our idea was also to bridge this research and teaching gap through the podcast, through dialogues. But it's not always easy. And you've done a lot of work, you've done a lot of research on this. So what, in your opinion, what do you see as the biggest source of misunderstanding between these two parties, between researchers and classroom teachers? Because I feel like a lot of teachers feel that research isn't designed with their realities in mind.
I would say maybe one of the biggest impediments is maybe both parties don't necessarily assume goodwill on the part of the other. So researchers get frustrated. Teachers just ignore us. They don't listen to us. They think we're arrogant and out of touch. And some researchers are. We did a study of researchers' attitudes about whether they wanted their research to have an impact on teachers. And many did. And many of them were teachers themselves or had been teachers. And there was less of a divide in that regard than is sometimes, I think, made out to be. And I think teachers also can be suspicious of researchers. And I would say that for the most part, we're all wanting the same thing. I think we're wanting to help learners. And so I think if we can get past that kind of a certain level of mistrust, then we can address some of the other systemic barriers that are in place, such as the way that teachers and researchers are rewarded differently. We're not really rewarded to talk to each other in terms of like pay increases, promotion, what's valued in our various realms. And that would be, and I'll call myself out here first and foremost, our academic program is on the same floor as our English Language Center, and I have good friends with some of the teachers and all of that. But do we sit down and talk about language teaching and those types of things? Do we do joint research projects? A little bit, but certainly not as much as we could. And so it's hard to put into practice on a daily level, even in a very positive context like Michigan State, where there's generally good rapport and respect on both parts. And it's just, we're each busy doing the things that we need to do and the things that will get us the professional rewards that we want. And they don't always involve sitting down and designing a joint research project to investigate questions that are important to teachers.
Thank you.
But when that does happen, it can be pretty cool.
Yeah.
I've been involved in a couple of projects that have been really rewarding because there has been that collaboration and you're answering questions or investigating questions that are really important to teachers. And that's part of what I find rewarding about my job.
Very cool. Which, if Leah will allow me, leads to a nice last question another question that we have here about how those people talk to each other or don't, or their relationship. Because you're in charge, Shawn, of the second language doctoral program there at MSU.
Yes.
Which means we're assuming you're training, at least locally, the next generation of SLA scholars.
Indeed.
What qualities or perspectives do you hope your trainees or those people, as they move forward in their career, take forward to continue this, either with what you talked about with that dynamic of teacher-researcher dialogue, or just AI, learning, pedagogy, etc.?
Guess what I would want them to move forward with, and I'll couch this by saying, we have a wide variety of the diversity of faculty, research interests, theoretical perspectives, etc. And I had the privilege of teaching the first year seminar, professional development seminar this last semester. And so I had all of our first year students in there, and they have a variety of interests. They're working with different advisors. But I guess the thing that I really hope that they would leave with, one, obviously, would be a strong foundation in whatever it is that they're interested in, their theoretical perspective, their research methodology, and all that. But I guess I would just say maintain curiosity and openness to learning new things, new ideas, because things are changing even more rapidly. And it'll be interesting to see what our profession looks like in 5-10 years. And so if they can have that openness to explore new things, to learn new things, and to be flexible and adaptable, I think is going to be important moving forward. And the other thing is, I sometimes get frustrated if students are like, what's supposed to be my research topic for my dissertation? I need one research topic. And I'm like, if you're a researcher, you should be able to research. I've got so many ideas that I would love to research. Be curious. There's a ton of stuff out there. I'm not going to have enough time in my life to do all the research projects I'd like to, because so I think being curious, being just always asking what's going on here, what can we do to, I think as an applied science, what can we do to make life better for teachers, for learners, is part of what we should be doing.
We have some questions from the audience. And do you want to start with the one from John?
Sure.
Good question.
Yeah, let's do the first one. Yeah, so our friend John Healy, who runs My Speaking Score, and they actually use technology and AI to help students improve their speaking for the TOEFL test. So that's interesting. John asks, what's a common classroom practice that research, at least that you've done or know about, the research consistently shows does not help language acquisition, but typically, let's umbrella term, teachers keep doing it anyway?
I would say the decontextualized, meaningless drills that are often done, the audiolingual approach. One of the programs that I used, the online programs, was very audiolingual based, and just you substituted, what time does mom get up in the morning? What time does dad get up in the morning? And it was mind numbing. And I was shocked to see that this type of audiolingual approach was still present in one of the current, probably one of the leading online language learning programs. We haven't mentioned it yet, so I won't, not one. And I haven't done any research on it directly, but I just was, that kind of audiolingual drill approach, I would say, is probably the one that I find, is.
Perfect. All right, good. Leo, last one to you.
I have one from Peter. This is actually a good question because the person who has written a paper on this is someone that I've been trying to get on the show. And you probably know who this person is, but the question is about noticing. And is asking basically how you would define noticing, its role in SLA, what evidence is there for it. And he's also asking you if you believe that it is, quote unquote here, a necessary prerequisite for acquisition. Because he actually sent me a screenshot of page 55 of your ISLA book. And he's basically saying that this is very contrary to Schmidt's, his updated version of the noticing hypothesis, which proposes noticing could be helpful rather than a necessary condition of acquisition. And he also apologizes if he misunderstood it. But it's a question that I have about noticing, because I used to be a very strong proponent of noticing, to a point where I'm like, I don't know if noticing actually is what it's meant to be or what it means to be. But perhaps you could tell us more about that.
Sure. What page was that? I'll have to go
Page
back and look.
55. I can read the quote. He's basically saying, example, Kuiken and Vedder, in their study of 34 Dutch high school students performing dictogloss tasks in pairs, interaction or individually with no interaction, did not find any effect for interaction in learners' knowledge of English passives. However, this is the part that is highlighted. Analysis of learners' discourse during the tasks and their reflections after the task revealed numerous examples of interaction resulting in increased noticing, a necessary prerequisite for acquisition.
Interesting. Because I was going to start with saying, I think if we believe that implicit learning exists, then noticing is not part of implicit learning. And I do think that implicit learning does happen for language learning. I don't know that it happens a lot. And so I'll have to have a little look at that passage and see. So is noticing a necessary prerequisite? Not if you believe that implicit learning happens. And I would say I do believe implicit learning happens. So I would say, no, it is not necessary. Is it helpful? Yes. Can it be facilitative of acquisition? Definitely. I'm a cognitive interactionist, so that's something that is important to me. Andrew, I think an example of your feedback that you got when you were in Costa Rica on your 75-year-old sayings was a learning opportunity for you, because I think that fits into the heart of negotiation of meaning or noticing what you want to say, and you notice at whatever level. And defining noticing, I'm not one who likes to quibble over definitions and operationalizations. I understand that they're important, but I think for teachers, that's an easy way to lose them because they're not interested in that. Theorists are interested in that. But that provides an opportunity. And I would imagine, Andrew, there might actually be something that you still remember to this day of what you noticed because you were conversing and communicating. And that's not noticing at the level that we're talking about with like recasts or more implicit types of noticing. That probably was much more explicit. But I think that is beneficial. And I think bringing together that use of language and that ability to be aware, to notice, and I realize I'm using those terms without any definitions or operationalization, so I do apologize, but I'm not going to give them. I do think it is important, and I do think that's one of the ways that we get around some of the difficulties of explicit grammar instruction is tying it in with that communication that maybe you've learned a rule. So now you're conversing or you're reading and all of a sudden you see, oh, okay, there's an example of that rule. So it can be beneficial. But again, language learning, I would say, is probabilistic. It doesn't always work. And operationalizing things like noticing there's still disagreement on what it is. And so I don't know.
It's funny you're mentioning that because even my mom, I was talking to my mom when she was here and I was observing her. She actually could explain to me things that I'm like, how did you? She's like, I just noticed that. And I funny because she used the word noticed. And I'm like, how did you notice that? Because I'm very interested because I feel like in language teaching, at least my experience and has been a lot of the noticing is I want you to notice a very specific grammatical structure. There's something that is very salient in the text that we want the students to notice. But when I think about notice today, it's more of I'm going in that direction. To me, that's a more implicit notice as opposed to an explicit notice, if we can. And what do I mean by an implicit noticing? It would be something like you performed a task and then you see someone else performing and you're like, oh, man, I could have said that. So the noticing could be noticing how you perform, but not necessarily the noticing should be, oh yeah, I noticed that he used the present perfect to talk about an experience that he's had recently. Not noticing, that to me is I would refer to explicit noticing. I don't know if that makes any sense, Shawn. I apologize if my ideas are a little scattered.
No, there's noticing at the level of comprehension, noticing at the level of understanding. They're noticing there are researchers or theorists who have honed in on that distinction that you're making there. In what level of noticing is it? There might be deeper levels of noticing. And so those affect the cognitive processes differently. But again, like how we measure those, how does a teacher measure that, right? Yeah. That's the difficult part. We can, as researchers, and people have used very precise different methodologies. Eye tracking, for example, is one that I've been involved in with a little bit to measure noticing, and that can provide some interesting data and information, but a teacher is not going to be able to do that. And so having a bit more of a general knowledge about interaction, noticing, to me, that's what's important. Yeah, that would be, again, where I guess it's the more practical parts of it rather than the theoretical definitions.
Right. Yeah. It may tie back to the beginning of our conversation, Shawn, with your Babbel story, you're going to Poland and using the apps Duolingo, because for me, anecdotally, but in my Spanish journey, like at the beginning when I first moved there, I knew nothing and I couldn't notice anything. Like I did nothing, like it was all over my head. Points where like those stories where people would chuckle or laugh and be like, oh, you sound like an old man, say this. But then as I improved, my motivation increased because I was learning and I became more invested. I started to notice, at least by listening, because I would listen to people on the bus and I would listen to conversations. And for whatever reason, I remember this one because I could never figure it out. And I would say, for masculine nouns in Spanish, some people say esto and some people say este. And I was like, what's the difference? And I asked all my local friends and they couldn't explain it to me. I don't know. As an aside, I did come to a point in my journey where I don't care what the rules are. It is what it is. And that's how you say it. And I don't care why. But then as I improved more, I was more curious, right? Because I was doing it. And then I figured out by listening to people, oh, when they say este with an E, it's followed by a noun. And when they say esto, it's not. So esto is like the relative pronoun, basically, right? And is este masculine noun, right? Follows it. And so I was able to like then, but this was like a year into the journey. At the beginning, I couldn't notice anything.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating to have those moments where you're puzzling something out and you hear it, you don't quite understand what or why. And then over time, you're like, oh, okay, I think either explicitly, maybe if they are able to explain a rule, or the classic L1 speaker responsive, I don't know, that's just what sounds right.
Yes.
But eventually you start to figure it out. And I think that's a great feeling. That's a great part of language learning.
I have one more question before we wrap up. And this is a question that we have, but a listener also asked the same question. I think it was Deepika, who basically was asking, let me find her question here. It was about the divide, not the divide, but, oh, yes, here. Actually, I can't find the question. It's here somewhere. I have too many. I was taking too many notes and I lost track.
We noticed that you can't find the question.
I found a quote by Mike Long and I was like, oh, I want to talk about that, but we're not going to have time.
Sorry, Deepika.
I think I found it here now. I'm going to go back to the post. I think that's the only way for me to find the question. But it's somewhat related to what we were just talking about earlier. Yeah.
English as a lingua franca, I think. Yeah.
And basically she's asking a very similar question, like how can practicing language teachers read and learn from current research, especially when primarily most research is inaccessible for people who are either not in academia or affiliated with a university?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. There have been some efforts that have been made. OASIS summaries, I would imagine you're familiar with those. It is an effort to provide one-page jargon-free explanations of research projects that would be useful for teachers. I think that's a good initiative, but the onus is still on the teachers to find them and to access them. But at least it's who has time to read a whole research article unless you're a PhD student, and who, was very humbling. We had a symposium a few years ago where it was on the research practitioner interface. And Masatoshi was there. He was part of it. And we had a university French teacher critique one of our articles and what a teacher would find interesting or important about it. And there was about a paragraph that they said, oh, this would probably be interesting to teachers. So it was very humbling as a researcher to hear that. But so that's one thing. I know Masatoshi's also been involved in I think it's T-Cell Graphics, I think is the name of it, trying to make research accessible. And that's the difficulty, is it's just a never-ending process because it's not a one and done thing. As teachers keep coming through, you keep getting trained, there will be new teachers. There's always this, how do we communicate to them in meaningful ways? And so I'm not sure. There are some journals that I think, ELT journal, I think is a really good one that is accessible I feel is really accessible to teachers. They try to keep academics, they limit the number of citations you can have. They really I feel they do a really good job of trying to make sure that research is accessible and meaningful to teachers.
Yeah.
And I think access is a real problem in terms of even physical access. A lot of articles are behind paywalls. There's the open access movement is gaining momentum, and a lot more is open access now. In one of the research projects that we did in Chile, Masatoshi and I found that teachers were exchanging articles on social media. So they would, make available, those who had access would make available articles that other people wanted. If people are interested in reading articles, I would say email the researcher. That, again, puts the onus on the teacher, but I would say many researchers, I'm happy if whoever, says, hey, I can't get this article. Usually it's a PhD student, but they're like, would you send it to me? And I'm happy to do that. I think most researchers are happy to make their research available. So those are some ways, but it's not easy. It's not easy.
And that was perhaps one of the main reasons also why we wanted to have the podcast. We wanted to find a way to bridge this gap for a lot of language teachers. Our audience is primarily language educators, language teachers, but I feel like we're gaining also a lot of momentum with universities, colleges, and higher ed, and that's what we want. We want to make sure that we facilitate this dialogue, which brings me to my final question. And this is just a hypothetical question because we don't have the finances for this, but if we could pay you to have a big billboard outside to thousands, millions of people with one insight that you wish more teachers understood about how second languages are really learned, what would it be?
I'd want to workshop the phrase a little bit, but the gist of it would be something along the lines of meaningful communication is really important for language learning. As much as I love language and grammar rules and that type of thing, and phonological rules and all these kinds of things, I think for the average person to be successful, there needs to be a communicative component. There needs to be some meaning that is happening, some meaning making. That I think would be my billboard. Probably run it through AI a couple of times to finesse it, but something about communication and the importance of using it for human interaction in some way.
That's great. That's great.
They charge by the character. That's a prompt. Make it as economical as possible for our billboard.
Yes.
I've been thinking of a title for a book, but every time I say it out loud, it reminds me of someone else's campaign platform and their logo, which is Make Language Teaching Communicative Again. But then when I think about, there's somewhere else where they say something that make America something again, and I'm like, it wouldn't. I feel like it would reach the wrong audience. But I still think it's a great title because it's very much connected to what you said here, Shawn. Shawn, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate having you here. And
it's been a pleasure.